we can go back to the middle of the 18th century to examine how, in the changing context of the 18th century, when the Mughal Empire was in a state of decline, when traditional arteries of trade were shrinking, when the East India Company in India was competing with the French, the Dutch, and finally, on the strength of the privilege that the East India Company managed to acquire from the declining Mughals, they created the foundation, the commercial foundation, on which subsequently they created their empire. So, as we try to explain the origins of British imperialism in India, we have to bear in mind three critical points. In the first place, the larger context of the 18th century was characterized by the decline of the Mughal Empire. And certainly, this had a bearing on the way the Europeans were becoming very powerful. And one of the ways to increase their local power was to link up with the courtiers in the different Mughal courts. Second point that needs to be stressed concerns the growing hegemony, the growing dominance of the European trading groups, the company, but the company was not alone because most of its servants were also trading in private capacity. They are involved, may not be in interoceanic trade, but they are involved in coastal trade, they are participating in inland trade. So the relationship that the company managed to establish with powerful merchant groups within Indian society needs emphasis. Thirdly, if we say that Bengal was the British bridgehead, it was in Bengal that the process of imperial expansion had begun with the defeat of Nawab Siraj-ud-Dawla in the Battle of Plassey. Then Plassey has to be situated in the larger backdrop of the changing position of the East India Company in Indian politics and commerce. Its growing political importance at one level, its growing commercial importance at another level, and the way the company had been able to marginalize not merely its European competitors, but also managed to undermine and turn the Indian traders into dependent merchants. There has been a tendency among some scholars to argue that if you are looking for the roots of imperialism, you look at the way empire was being created. It is called the non-European foundation of European imperialism. And obviously, it implies the kind of connection that the East India Company or the other European companies were establishing with Indian people, merchants, courtiers, soldiers, and it was on their support that they were able to create their empire. So this is one kind of argument, which is emphasizing the kind of support and collaboration that the Europeans were receiving from Indian society. So you have the main protagonist of this argument in a scholar like Christopher Bailey, who has recently, a couple of decades back, of course, written a book called Indian Society and the Making of the British Empire. Obviously, the title is very suggestive, that if you are looking for the creation of empire, you have to look at the Indian society. Now, this kind of emphasis on the way the Indians were contributing to the making of the empire, in my assessment, is somewhat misplaced. Because in the end, the territorial empire that the English were able to create had behind it the dynamic of commerce. I mean, they came here to trade, and in order to maximize their profits from trade, they wished to create a territorial base, partly because of the privileges that they were going to derive out of political control, partly because of the kind of control that they came to establish on revenue. And revenue began to be used for trading purposes, something which in the 18th century language was called investment. But let us first look at the 18th century. What was the kind of change that was taking place in the 18th century that would eventually open the ground for the Europeans to intervene, particularly the British. The intervention in 1757 was not a sudden event, was not a kind of a revolution that the contemporaries experienced and became somewhat awestruck or became somewhat nonplussed by the suddenness of the event. Gradually, slowly, incrementally, the British were trying to carve out a powerful space for themselves within the changing scenario of 18th century politics and commerce. If you look at the 18th century, it was the story of the poignant story of the decline of the Mughals. And as the empire declined, regional states were formed. Mughal governors set up the state of Bengal under Murshid Quli Khan. Then Chin Khalid Khan formed, established Hyderabad. Sadat Khan, Burhanul Mulk set up Awadh. You have regional states in Mysore. You have Maratha Sardars setting up their own independent niches. Later on, you have the Sheikhs under Ranjit Singh creating another kingdom in the west. So, in this kind of centrifugalism, so to say, I mean, the way the center was not actually holding its own, regions were asserting their autonomy, there was also a change in the structure of India's trade. India's maritime trade was concentrated in West Coast in Mughal times. Surat was the main port, which was linked with Hormuz and Aden in West Asia, and there was a flourishing coastal trade from Surat to the south, to Calicut, to Cambay, and via Calicut and the tip of the peninsula, ships moved along the coastline towards the east. But the critical link point was the west coast of India, but Surat declined.
Sir, why do you think that the preeminent port of Surat declined?
The decline of Surat had been determined by political factors. You know, 18th century was a period when not merely the Mughals declined. You have almost simultaneously, you have the decline of the Safavids in Iran, the decline of the Ottomans in Turkey. You have political troubles in Yemen. You know, Yemen, Muscat and Aden were very close to Yemen. So you have a kind of an overall troublesome situation in the entire region. And the major difficulty that the port of Surat began to face came from the way its link with the Indian hinterland began to be snapped. Because Surat was the kind of an entrepot, the central Mughal port. Large ships owned by the emperor, by imperial nobles, sailed towards West Asia. And it was a kind of an emporium, collecting commodities from Benares, from Bengal, from northern India, from Lahore. So from all over the different parts of Mughal Empire, commodities used to pour into Surat to be taken to other places by the large ships of the emperor and the nobles. But when political troubles in North India in the course of the 18th century snapped its link with the hinterland, Surat began to decline. The arteries began to atrophy. It is in this context the interest of the East India Company, which as you know was located mainly initially in Surat, the interest began to be refocused towards the east. And it is in this context then that one has to study the kind of interest that the East India Company began to develop in Bengal and in Calcutta. Calcutta, as you know, was founded, although the date cannot be, any fixed date cannot be assigned, people say that already Calcutta was growing because traders were moving down to Calcutta from the northern reaches of the river. But once the company set up its warehouse in Calcutta, there was a tremendous expansion of the trade from Calcutta. Calcutta fleet was increasing in size. And it was from Calcutta that the main thrust towards establishing a kind of commercial dominance had begun. And the great advantage that the East India Company received in the early part of the 18th century was Farrukh Shia's Farman of 1717. It gave the company exemption from customs and inland duties, something that one of his predecessors, Shah Shuja, had already given in 1650, but the company still had to pay a certain amount of money to the imperial treasury. But once Farrukh Shia's Farman was actually granted to the company, and the company received this particular privilege of being able to trade without paying duties, it was now actually drawing Indian traders to itself. It was actually creating a powerful network. It was turning these Indian traders into dependent traders. Boats which carried commodities from Calcutta to North Indian riverine ports, invariably Indian traders would allow the English boats to carry their goods because they don't have to pay anything by way of taxes. So, that I would imagine was the first step taken by the company to forge intimate links with local traders.
So, but sir, how is it that Indian trade became more dependent on the company?
Partly because of the kind of privilege that the company was endowed with by Farrukh Shah in 1717. Some historians describe it as the Magna Carta of English trade in India. I mean, you are able to carry commodities to different parts of the Mughal Empire without having to pay any taxes. So, if you are not actually paying any taxes, you can sell your commodities for cheaper prices, and you will certainly have a greater competitive advantage over your rivals. As a result, the Indian traders who had to pay their taxes began to use these European boats as their fronts. This kind of connection that was forged more prominently from the early 18th century gave the company a certain advantage, certain privilege that, of course, began to be abused. As you know, that in the course of in the second quarter of the 18th century, when the company was actually involved in periodic bouts of conflict with the Bengal Nawabs, frequently the Nawabs complained about the way the company's traders were actually misusing this privilege.
Sir, why was it that they exempted the company from paying the taxes?
This is very difficult to explain, but perhaps because of the kind of influence that the company had already begun to exercise in the regional Mughal courts. I mean, people recommended their case to the emperor. So the emperor gave them this privilege. But the privilege nonetheless is very significant because it gave the company a certain extra power, commercial power in the region. And it was easier for them to link up with the local traders, local trading groups. You have all heard about Omichand, the famous Punjabi Khatri merchant of Calcutta, one of the great collaborators of the English East India Company. And it was with people like Omichand that the company decided to forge their connection since the early part of the 18th century. So that when that conflict actually began to brew up with Siraj-ud-Dawla in 1777, a group of Indian courtiers, a group of Indian traders would rally behind the English East India Company to give the English a fairly easy victory in Plassey. As you know, Plassey was a skirmish. It didn't have any military significance, but it was politically very significant. It was after Plassey that the process of expansion had begun from the Eastern Indian stronghold of the East India Company, gradually, as you know, came to be incorporated within the British Empire. The company also emerged as a very powerful pressure group in Indian politics, not just in Bengal, but almost in every part of India. Look at Hyderabad, look at Awadh, you will find them present. And not the French, not the British alone. You have the French company also vying for the same kind of privilege, the same kind of power within this Indian political and commercial scenario. So, against this backdrop of the changing commercial scenario in this country, against the backdrop of the decline of the Mughal power, the rise of the regional states, and the gradual accommodation of these Europeans as pressure groups in these regional states, you have to locate the intervention of 1757. So, if 1757 was a turning point, then it was not really a sudden event. I mean, you see the factors building up for about a century to give the English a very easy passage to victory in Plassey. So, if you now look at the second question, if they were interested in territorial power, if they were interested in creating an empire, if we are to believe that the empire was not given to them, they created it. Some British would have us believe, some English scholars would have us believe that there was no initiative on the part of the Brightons to create an imperial system or the imperial order in India. The empire was a kind of an accident. But this position is invalidated by the story of how the company very deliberately became involved in local politics in order to carve out a space, not just a commercial space that they had been enjoying from an earlier time, with privileges, but also political space. And this, I believe, had something to do with investment. It's linked with commerce, but it's a problem of investment. The normal practice for all these European companies was to exchange bullions for goods. They would bring precious metals, gold and silver. They would take these metals to a money changer, saraf or shroff. They would convert, the shroffs would convert these bullions into local currency by charging a commission. But sometime around the middle of the 18th century, maybe a little earlier, these European monarchies were now very reluctant to allow this kind of drain of wealth to Asia, on the ground that such depletion of wealth from Europe or from their own countries would actually make them vulnerable militarily. And it is in this kind of a situation that the Europeans became interested in territorial revenue. Privileges they were getting in any case, but once they would achieve power in Bengal, as we know, the British would actually try to impose far more restrictions on Indian traders, would turn the collaborators into dependents. An independent collaborating trader would be turned into a banyan or a gumasta, an underling. The British would then try to impose restrictions on local artisans and weavers, asking them not to deal with anyone else except the English East India Company. But the revenue was the great boon that a company or a trader always would look for, to be able to trade without paying anything. So they were collecting huge sums of money by way of revenue in Bengal. It was the richest Mughal Suba, would convert it into bullion, transfer a part of this bullion subsequently to China, and then part of this bullion would go to Madras to allow companies' investment in Madras. So Bengal revenue would certainly emerge once the British would achieve complete political power after 1765 as the critical factor in smoothening the process of English East India Company's commercial and political domination, an advantage that the French or other competitors didn't have. The French, however, had shown them the way. It was from the French that the British learned this strategy of establishing some control over territorial revenue by carving out a space. You are maybe familiar with the conflict between the French and the British in India. The French attacked the British settlement in 1746, and once they were able to prove their prowess, rival contestants for the throne of Carnatic and Hyderabad looked for their support, French support. So you have the English East India Company propping up certain people, Muhammad Ali Walaja as their candidate in the Carnatic. The French propped up someone else, Chanda Sahib, but the issue was settled in their favor, in favor of the British. When Muhammad Ali Walaja was installed as the Nawab of Carnatic, and in return, the British received a lot of privileges.
Sir, this clash between the British and the English, was it only
Between the French and the
sorry,
English, I mean.
British and the French?
Ah.
Was it for the like domination over India? I mean, was it only that reason?
Partly so, but you know, it had a European story as well, because in the 1740s, as you know, the French and the British were clashing in different parts of the world as well, in Europe, in Americas. So, in a way, the clash between the English and the French in India was a reenactment of that conflict, that European conflict. But as I was just explaining to you, that it had an Indian dimension as well. That Indian dimension came from the involvement of both the British and the French in local politics, trying to prop up their own proteges as rulers of local kingdoms or principalities which had emerged on the ruins of the Mughal Empire. The case of the Carnatic I have just cited, but the fact of the matter is that why were they trying to prop up somebody as a local ruler, whether in Carnatic or in Bengal? Because through such men who would be more amenable to their control, they would have a firmer grasp, firmer grip over territorial revenue. And this territorial revenue was extremely important for the Europeans then, because of this problem of investment. So if you look at the way the agreement was reached between Muhammad Ali Walaja and the British, you see the kind of abiding interest of European companies in territorial revenue. In return for the support that Muhammad Ali Walaja received from the English company, he agreed to part with a portion of his own revenue fund to the English. The French had done the same thing in Hyderabad, where they had succeeded in installing Muzaffar Jung as the Nizam of Hyderabad. Muzaffar Jung was the French protege, and Muzaffar Jung had agreed to part with a certain districts of his kingdom to the company, so that the company could actually, French company in this case, French company could actually derive certain revenue resources through this kind of control over the revenue fund. In Bengal, you can see what happened after 1765 or even after 1757. What was the agreement between Mir Jafar Ali, who was the successor, who was installed by East India Company as the Nawab? The agreement was that certain districts of Bengal Suba must be given over to the company for the company to derive revenue resources. This process would be completed in 1765 after the defeat of Mir Qasim in the Battle of Buxar, with the transfer of Diwani. In all Mughal provinces, you have two different administrative powers. Nizamat, which was exercised by the Subadar or the Nazim, the criminal jurisdiction, the authority of police, and you have the Diwani power, which was concerned with finance. So the company became the Diwan on the strength of an order that was issued by Emperor Shah Alam. So the pressure group, an institution, a party, or a trading company which actually acted as a pressure group, was now becoming the ruler, was now actually claiming a certain share in the right to rule. And their right to rule had come to be endorsed by the Mughal emperor. So that is where trade politics and empire, the relationships between trade politics and empire come in. That is where the commercial dynamic was important in creating a certain interest in territory, certain interest in territorial revenue. And that is the reason why Bengal has been looked upon as the British bridgehead.
So, sir, what role did the Indians play in the making of the empire?
Powerful groups of courtiers and traders actively collaborated with the East India Company, even before the company became the imperial rulers. You have army men, for example. All these soldiers who served the East India Company's army and helped the company in extending its territory from Bengal to other parts of India were Indian. The entire Bengal army of the East India Company was Indian in composition, high caste army, recruited largely from northern India. So, this is a point which has to be taken note of, but cannot be overemphasized. But once the empire was established, all these people who had collaborated with the company would become their underlings, their dependents. That relationship equality would be removed, and that is the basic logic of imperialism. Because ultimately, imperialism implies the domination of one people over another, in the same way as the traders were, because as I said, most of these independent traders lost their vocation and became entirely dependent on the company and the private traders allied with the company, European traders allied with the company. Same happened to the courtiers. The great 18th century aristocrats who had carved out their own political spaces by establishing local kingdoms had over time disappeared, and they were replaced by the English rulers who created their own imperial system, their own government, their own structure of rule, their own laws. Eventually, the lip service that the East India Company had paid to the Mughal emperor, when the Mughal emperor actually endowed them with the Diwani right, when Mughal emperor endowed some of these British soldiers or British officials with warriors with imperial title, Mughal imperial title. As you know, Clive was actually given this title of the victor in war, Sabat Jung, by Shah Alam. So all this would become irrelevant once the imperial system would come on its own.